panelist tonight is Dr. Laura Lasiter. Dr. Lasiter is Director of Health Policy at Friends of Cancer Research, which is an advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. that works to drive advances in science, policy, and regulation to speed life-saving treatments to patients. Laura leads policy development related to drug and diagnostic test development and regulation. Prior to joining Friends, Laura was a Congressional Science Fellow for the AAAS Science and Technology Fellowship, where she covered the health portfolio of Senator Al Franken on the Senate Help Committee, primarily focused on issues relating to the FDA and prescription drug prices. She has also served as the director of the Mid-South Academic Alliance, the workforce development arm of Life Science Tennessee, which is a nonprofit that advocates for the life science industry in the state. She received her PhD in biomedical sciences from the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. So, Laura?
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how nonprofits can play a role in science policy and advocacy. First, I just want to give you a little bit of background about the organization, Friends of Cancer Research. We are, as Ben mentioned, a Washington, D.C. Based science policy and advocacy organization. We actually were founded over 20 years ago with initially the sole purpose of advocating for federally funded research in translational sciences and drug development. But over the last 20 years, we've morphed into this science policy or think tank organization that's focused on drug development policy and the science needed to support that policy. So as throughout the talk that I'm going to give, I'm going to focus more on the mechanics of science policy, but the two primary points that I wanted to make, and you'll notice is a theme throughout the entire all of the talks today, are one, science policy doesn't occur in a vacuum. And so collaboration partnerships are really key. No different than science. The research that comes out of one lab in one publication is not going to move the entire field of science forward. It's about a collective, the collection of science coming from many different scientists and laboratories over time that are able to really move any particular area of science forward. And the same thing is the case for science policy. You absolutely have to work with other organizations and partner with them to make an impact in science policy. So, at Friends, we focus on our relationships with federal agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the National Institutes of Health, the National Cancer Institute, other academic research centers, professional societies, industry, and other advocacy organizations. And together, our collective efforts make a big impact. And the second primary thing that I want to call out is many people have mentioned the relationships. Science policy the engine is relationships, whether that is the relationship between Congress and the executive branch and science in general, or all the way down to the individual relationships that you as a scientist establish with federal or congressional Hill staffers, for example. And these relationships take time. And I've noticed a lot of people have been asking questions about how do I reach out to Congress, how do I make an impact, get them to listen. Don't be surprised if you reach out and that doesn't lead to one email doesn't lead to an entirely new piece of legislation. It's about establishing a relationship with those staffers over time so that they learn that they can trust you and go to you when they need input or when they need answers. So what I wanted to talk about here with this slide is really to show the directionality. It's a two-way street in science, and we've already heard, and Adriana already touched very nicely on the fact that Congress in many cases sets the trajectory for science, in that being money funding for grants or requiring the executive branch to issue guidances that influence science. And where science policy organizations fit into that is that we, and many times are the ones who, we're the workhorse. We're the ones that develop the policies. We think about the processes that to help implement those guidances. And some of the primary work products that policy organizations utilize: research papers, white papers. That's basically a policy or paper that you can publish. An op-ed, public comments that are submitted to federal agencies, and direct advocacy. But as I mentioned, it's a two-way street. So policy is also influenced by the science, and nonprofits are also responsible for that. So we are the organizations that identify problems in the field of science and develop policy solutions supported by the data that we then take back to the executive branches and Congress, and we advocate for legislation and regulations. I have a note here that advocacy is a lot more than just asking for research funding. It's providing feedback on legislation. It's sending, there's this new article published in JAMA. Here, staffer, let me send this to you so you can see some of the impacts of policy that are being made on science, or any kinds of back and forth that you can have with policymakers. So let's get into some of these touch points that I've mentioned, and I'm going to give you some of the mechanics and actual examples of how Friends has influenced policy in recent years. So one of these, how do we use science to implement legislation? You may or may not be aware that the FDA runs off of user fees, which means that when a drug company wants to have a drug approved by the FDA, they actually have to submit their application and they pay a fee that goes along with that to support the review. The ability to collect that fee is reauthorized by Congress every 5 years and often has a lot of other requirements tied along with it. So the last user fee legislation that was passed in 2017 actually included some components where it required drugs, parts of legislation that influenced drugs development for pediatric cancers, and directed the FDA to publish a list of molecular targets for pediatric cancers that drugs should be developed for. In implementing that list, the FDA actually reached out to Friends of Cancer Research and said, can you bring the right people together to give us that, give us advice on how to make that list? And so we actually brought a group of people together, experts in the field. We wrote a white paper, we held a public meeting, and FDA later took the advice from the experts from our working group and created a list of molecular targets that they have published on their website. So how does science policy impact regulatory policy? This is an example where Friends of Cancer Research, again, we brought together numerous experts in the field of clinical trials, and we thought about, we published in peer-reviewed journals 4 or 5, I think, publications talking about how clinical trials could include more diverse population. We would have better information and understanding about drugs used in a broader population than we do currently. Those were published, and FDA actually almost word for word took our recommendations and published them as guidance. And now drug manufacturers or developers utilize that information when designing their clinical trials. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about, I'll try to speed this up, was how science informs legislation. In the area of complex diagnostic tests and precision medicine. So drugs are now, in cancer particularly, being developed that are targeted to a specific mutation. The test that's used to identify whether a patient has that mutation is called, in a regulatory term, a companion diagnostic. Unfortunately, a lot of these biomarkers, not unfortunately, but they are very complicated, And there can be a range of values or ways that that biomarker is calculated from a diagnostic test. What we did at Friends was to create this biomarker harmonization pilot where we brought together, you can see on this page here, numerous diagnostic test companies, pharma companies, and academics together, and created a pilot to test to see just how diverse the results of tests can be using different algorithms and etc. And we published a manuscript, a peer-reviewed manuscript on the results of that pilot. That, along with a series of white papers that we've published over several years, we've shared with Capitol Hill and have been involved in a diagnostic test stakeholder advocacy group, which advocates and goes to the Hill and meets with congressional staff. There is now a valid act that's been introduced into Congress talking about to unify or harmonize the way that diagnostic tests are regulated. And that legislation includes several provisions that we had developed and suggested for Congress. So I know we're over, so I'm just going to really quickly, Friends of Cancer Research has an annual meeting. We've actually got several virtual meetings scheduled for this year. You can visit our website. They're all online, they're all free, and would provide some great opportunities to see policy actually in action. So you can follow me on LinkedIn if you have any other questions. Please feel free to reach out to me. My email's at the bottom of the slide.
Great, thank you.